Ernie Dumas. So maybe before we get to you starting with Arkansas Week, tell me a little of your background before you came on Arkansas Week, when you started as a journalist, and a little of your background.
Okay. Well, I started as a journalist in high school at El Dorado in 1954. And I took a journalism class in high school because my brother told me you do that because you don't have any homework and you get an automatic A. You don't have to spend any time on it. And I did. And you work for the little high school newspaper. And after about a month, the journalism teacher in high school came up and said, well, would you like to work at the El Dorado Daily News? And I said, doing what? And she said, well, as a reporter, a writer. And I said, well, sure. She said, well, go down and see Bob Hayes. And I did, and I didn't catch, I lived way out in the country, and so I missed the bus, and I walked downtown and talked to Bob Hayes, and he hired me, and so I started covering City Hall and courthouse and a little politics and everything when I was a senior in high school. So that's how I got started, and then I went to Henderson State Teachers College and got run off from there in 1958 because of a little editorial in the college paper about the school crisis in Little Rock. So I transferred to the University of Missouri and graduated there in 1960 and went to work for the Gazette. And so I worked at the Gazette as a reporter and then later as an editorial writer until it closed in 1980, October 19th, 1991.
And when did you start coming on Arkansas Week?
Well, my memory is, I'm not too confident about my memory of all of that. It was way back there. But I'm thinking that I was on the first Arkansas Week show, but there might have been one or two before that. But my recollection is that there was a guy from Dallas named Tom Grimes who had been down there and of course started a show there, I think, sort of like Washington Week. That was the kind of the format. And he started a show like that down there, was on it or something. And he comes up here to teach at University of Arkansas at Little Rock and I think presents this idea to PBS here. Well, let's start a Washington Week in Arkansas Week. And so I wasn't familiar with all of that until one day, as I say, I was by that time an editorial writer at the Gazette. And I got a call from somebody up here that said, well, we're going to start this first program this week of Arkansas Week. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, well, you're going to be on the show, weekly show of Arkansas Week. And I said, well, I didn't know anything about that. And it turns out they had called Hugh Patterson, the publisher of the Gazette, and said, we want somebody from the Gazette to be on Arkansas Weekly show. And he said, Ernie Dumas will do that. So I didn't want to be on television. I didn't think I was cut out for television, and still don't. But anyway, so I felt like I had no choice about the matter. So I showed up here to record the first show. And of course, Tom Grimes was the moderator. And my recollection was, and I'm not sure this is the first show, but it was the first show I was on. And Paul Greenberg, the Pulitzer Prize winning editorial writer for the Pine Bluff Commercial, was on the show. And John Ward, it was later on earlier on Rockefeller's staff, and by that time was the managing editor, I think, of the Log Cabin Democrat at Conway. He was on the show with me, and I suppose there was somebody else, and that was the first show. And I think after that, neither of them wanted to be on anymore. I don't know why. I asked John Ward later, why did you not stay on Arkansas Week? And he says, oh, well, I wasn't cut out for television or something. And I said, well, I wasn't either. But anyway, and Paul Greenberg just said he was too busy down at Pine Bluff to come up here on Fridays and do that. So that's my recollection of how Arkansas Week got started, at least my role in Arkansas Week.
Do you remember topics from those early shows?
I don't remember. I could look back, I guess, and see what was happening in whatever it was, April of 1983. That was, I'm sure, the Bill Clinton and the school. That was the year of the big school reform. We probably talked on that show quite a bit that year about the big school reform movement and Bill and Hillary Clinton and all that was the big event in Arkansas politics that year. Special session of the legislature, raised taxes and so forth. But so I'm sure that was a topic, maybe on that show, but certainly on quite a number of shows in 1983.
And were you on regularly from then on?
I was on regularly, and I thought I was compelled to be on regularly because Hugh Patterson, who was the publisher and who hired me and was the boss, and so I didn't think I could go tell Hugh Patterson I don't want to be on here. So it was every Friday, and so I think I was on practically every week for the first 4 or 5 years. And I think Grimes was, I don't remember how long, but he wasn't on the show very long until he moved, and I think he went back to Texas or someplace, and wherever he was teaching career took him. So then after that, there was a guy named Clarence Cash, and Clarence was not a journalist or a TV guy. He was a good-looking guy. He had a nice voice and everything, but he was a lawyer, and he had run for. He was in the. I think he had been in the Attorney General's office, and so he ran for Attorney General, and 1976, I guess, and was defeated by Bill Clinton. That's how Bill Clinton began his political career. He got elected Attorney General by beating Clarence Cash. So Clarence came on the show, and he was our moderator for several years, maybe not that long, but he was on quite a bit, and he worked so hard at it. He worked up a script. He'd call the day before and say, "Okay, here are the topics tomorrow. Be thinking about them and come up with an outline or something." And so he would do the same. He would write out this elaborate beginning. There were beautiful things. He'd write them out, and then he wanted to present them perfectly. So we'd start taping, and he'd get maybe 30 seconds into it, and he'd muff a word, and we'd have to start all over again. And I remember the producer of the show was over there pulling his hair out. But Clarence was a perfectionist, and he did not want. We'd get halfway through the show sometimes, and one of us would screw up. It might have been me, but have to start over with a sentence or something. And Clarence said, "We'll start over." We'd have to start all over again. And I remember the producer going over there just banging his head on the wall. But anyway, that was the early years of the show, and so I did the show regularly until probably 1986 or so, and John Robert Starr, who had been an AP, he and I had been reporters together at the Capitol in the early 60s. He was an AP Capitol reporter, and I was out at the Capitol for the Gazette covering the legislature and the Supreme Court. And so we knew each other out there, and he later became the bureau chief, and then he became managing editor of the Democrat Gazette. And so he wanted to be on the show and every week, and he or his columnist Meredith Oakley would kind of exchange things. So we were on the show one day, and we got mixed up about something, and I corrected him on something, and he got mad and on the show, and then I get back to the office, and it's on Friday afternoon, and of course that's when on the editorial page there's just a staff of 3 of us, and we had to produce editorials plus edit the letters to the editor and all the columnists and everything, and lay out the pages for Friday morning paper, the Saturday morning paper, and the Monday morning paper. I had to do all that on Friday, and I'd get back to the office, and they were, maybe at 6:30, and the other 2 would just be furious because I had left, and sometimes I'd have to come back on Saturday and work Saturday and Sunday and everything. So I got back, and they were kind of steaming at me, and so I said, "All right, I'll just quit this show then." So I did. I didn't check with Mr. Patterson. I quit and called John Brummett, who was at the Gazette, and John was happy to take over, and he came and was on the show off and on for many, many years after that. That's my memory of that era.
And when did you start coming back on?
Well, it was I guess 2 or 3 years. I went up when the Gazette closed. I came up to UCA. I didn't move up here, but I came up here to teach. And I taught journalism at the University of Central Arkansas for 7 or 8 years until I had a series of heart surgeries and decided, and my wife told me I was quitting teaching and everything else. So, and I had a couple of students in my first journalism class in 1992, a couple of students who later worked for UCA, for AETN, and she became a producer on the show, I think, and so she called me and asked me if I would be on. So, and Steve Barnes by that time was on the show, so I came back and I began to do it pretty regularly, off and on, for quite a few years until whenever it was that I gave up the ghost and quit for good 5 or 6 years ago. I don't remember. Yeah. You and I were on together for a while.
Together a lot, about 10, yes. 12 years ago, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. So that was the era. So that's my career as on Arkansas, my television career.
Any memories? You mentioned kind of some friction. I mean, any heated debates, anything, tension? On
the show?
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, we were always very congenial. There were some, I guess, some people who were politically or intellectually on the other side from me on issues, but we got along very well. I think it was a good cross-section of the show over the years. Steve Barnes did a great job over the years. He was an amazing moderator and more knowledgeable than any of us were about what we were talking about. So that the only real friction was, I guess, when John Roberts started. We were kind of pals, and I'd have him when I was teaching at UCA. I'd bring him up to talk to my classes, journalism classes. But we'd have some. You wouldn't know it, I guess, if you were watching. You wouldn't know there was any friction, but there was a little bit of friction, I guess, between us. But that's my only recollection of that.
Okay. Anything else worth adding? Anything else come to mind?
Well, I can't think of anything else.
Thoughts about the industry now, what's become of journalism?
Well, journalism has got a bleak future, and it's had a bleak future. I guess I began to worry about it back in the, particularly for newspapers, back in the 70s, when the growth of television and became a competitor with newspapers. And so newspapers began to really have some problems then. And then so lately, in the last 5 or 6 years, in the social media age of the social media, and newspapers are virtually hardly existent any longer, I think. The Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, which I think is an excellent newspaper, at least news-wise. But it's got a shrinking readership, and I don't see much future. And television, I guess, has some similar problems as a news agency.
As everything, it goes more and more toward social media.
Yes.
Bypassing editors and fact checkers.
Yeah, the facts and truth are no longer the measuring stick, I think, for what's news.
Jen?
Yeah. What did you think of Steve Barnes?
Well, I've always admired Steve Barnes, and we have been good friends over the years, as well as somewhat competitors, I guess, back in the day when he was with the television stations and so forth, and we were competitors. But I've always thought he was an amazing communicator. He was a good newsman, and still is. And I thought he did a masterful job on the show. He took care of me a lot of times, as I've told you, in my aging years, I would have trouble sometimes remembering names, and sometimes even in the middle of a sentence, I would forget what I was talking about. And so Steve would always catch immediately, kind of. So the readers probably never noticed that, but he would move on. Let's move on to something else. So he was very masterful about that.
He could kind of read. He knew where you were going and could finish the thought.
Yeah, he could.
If any of us stumbled.
Yeah, he could finish my thought if I started stumbling. Steve could finish his thought beautifully and move on to something else. And he made us all look good. I could not stand to watch myself on television or hear my voice. and still can't. And I'm not going to watch this.